Okay, Dr. Chinyere, you've heard the why from the monetary and fiscal representative of the monetary and fiscal authorities of Nigeria. You are, of course, just once again, Director General, Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. What is your take, Dr. Chinyere, in terms of what you've heard, the why this was done, the reaction of the private sector, and how things worked out from that period, Doctor?
Oh, thank you very much. Good morning to everyone listening, and good morning to my fellow panelists. I didn't quite hear the beginning of the conversation, but I did hear the closing part of what Dr. Mohammed said, and Sanya there as well. First of all, let me say thank you to Agora Policy for this opportunity and for the very insightful presentation on the highlight of the study on the impact of the reforms. At the private sector level, the recent macroeconomic reforms have affected businesses in different ways. So let's even look at the positives. And I think Sayande and Dr. Abzai had talked about the positives on these things. And I believe that when you put together the petrol subsidy removal, the exchange rates liberalization, monetary tightening, and electricity tariff adjustments, these have put a lot of pressure on the private sector. While on the positive side, the monetary and the fiscal side, it has corrected some major fiscal and market distortions that we've experienced for years. And over the years, the Chamber of Commerce, we have constantly advocated for the removal of the fuel subsidy because we didn't think that it represented sufficient benefit to the Nigerian people. Like Sarande alluded to, in some ways, we are funding our neighbors and giving some advantage to them, and we're not observing that. So removing the fuel subsidy, estimates have given an average of 7.5 billion of the resources that government can actually redirect or should redirect to infrastructure and human capital investment. Now, for me, at the private sector, that's what we want to see. We want to see that the savings from the fuel subsidy removal is funded infrastructure. Today, the private sector is still struggling with a bit of that because there had been a huge adjustment cost, of course. So in 2022, the fuel price was about 200. Suddenly it went on to about 1,000, and then now with all the crisis in the world, it's over 1,000. This represents direct costs to businesses. So for businesses that will have to generate their own power, and a lot of businesses are constantly generating their own power, that's a huge cost for them. Almost like between 40 and 50% of a business cost will be power. And if we believe that the savings from just the fuel subsidy removal should go into infrastructure, we want to see that is actually elevating some of the pressure on the private sector, but that hasn't been, that we're not seeing. So at the macro level, we've talked about the balance of payments improving. We've talked about the foreign reserve improving, and the fact that there's a lot of confidence now in the Nigerian economy. I agree. So the economy is growing, but that hasn't trickled down to the common man. That hasn't trickled down sufficiently to the businesses, particularly the small businesses, because their operating margin has over the years been, compressed. And in all of this, you also have that the consumer demand is reducing because of all what we have talked about. So with the fuel price going up, transportation is more difficult and more costly. And so businesses and the consumers are struggling. So what we want to see, while these macro reforms are great, and I commend the government for having the courage to put these reforms into motion, what we needed to have will be complementary policies that could support or cushion the pressure. So, for instance, when we had the fuel subsidy removal, we're expecting to see certain policies to support the private sector. There were talks about cash transfers. There were talks about credit to small businesses. But even those, it was difficult to track, to monitor, to know where those funds were going to. So there seemed to have been an uneven transmission across sectors. And this tells us that, there has to be a way for government to put in place certain things that can help. I mean, when we talk about SMEs, we can consider discretionary rate for SMEs. So while the CBN keeps interest rates high, we can, think of how can we support the SMEs a bit more. There's the National Credit Company that's supposed to help the SMEs, but then that even that hasn't the mechanics of that we haven't worked it out properly. So for me, the reform is good at the macro level, but we want productivity. We want productivity enhancing reforms by government that will help the private sector to scale, to expand, to employ more people, and to ensure that the private sector is thriving. For me, it's really important to continue the implementation trajectory, because sometimes we start implementation and we make these very commendable statements about all the things that we have put in place, but then there isn't sufficient execution power down the line. There isn't sufficient tracking or monitoring of what people are doing. For instance, you talked about credit. The Nigerian Credit Guarantee Company was launched many months ago. We haven't really heard anything. We haven't really seen how it's affecting the economy, or how it is, who is giving credit to, or how it's expanding in the private sector capacity for production. So some of these things, they're nice, and we have a lot of reforms and a lot of policies, and I do agree with you that they are great. But implementation, tracking, making sure that implementation is faster. And because if it takes you 10 years to deliver something that you're supposed to deliver in 1 year, then it is meaningless for the Nigerian people. So that's where we are, that some things are so slow that, we're not feeling any impact at all, and we really want to feel the impact. When people talk about power, so you keep saying, that have we seen that things have improved? I haven't seen anything improve. National grid has collapsed so many times. In Lagos, there's no light. In most part of Nigeria, there's no light. I was with, we had a session at the chamber with Tanzania. We had a Nigeria-Tanzania business forum, and they were telling us how they are almost like 24 hours on power. So there's smaller economy, yes, but we have been on this matter for too long. On this power issue, I was listening to somebody in the power sector recently, and she was describing how even the small power that we generate, we can't transmit. Why is the TCN in government hands, and nothing is moving from there? Some things can be privatized so that the private sector can take it on and work on it, so it will be efficient. So government sits on some of these things, and we talk about the nice policies, but we're not feeling it. We're not feeling it in the private sector. So things need to change. I think sometimes also just holding somebody accountable and making it public will help. I heard the CBN deputy governor talking about the backlog earlier, and the fact that we had them 2.5 billion, and they were it has a question marks. Do you know that at the time this whole thing was going on, there was no communication? So which one had question mark more than the other? What were the issues? If you say that there was collusion between private sector and the perhaps CBN officials, was anybody held accountable? Were there repercussions? No. So you say, that some things had question marks, but nobody knew anything. There were no details. So sometimes government will make all these assertions, but back to the private sector. If you don't get a private sector that is productive, you can't move the economy forward. And there's no way you can be productive in darkness. So we need to have the power aspect fixed, and fixed quickly, so that the private sector can then begin to expand. The CBN deputy governor talked about, the private sector is expanding, they're employing people. They expand and employing people, but can you imagine if they expand and employing people at 10% when they have the capacity to do it at 150%? So you can't sit and say, they're employing people, but the gap between what we are doing and what we can do is so huge. So it's important for us on the private sector side, we have the right infrastructure to work, to expand. We have access to credit that is so critical, particularly for small businesses. We need to give them concessionary rates so that they can begin to produce. We're talking about intra-Africa trade. How do we participate competitively in intra-Africa trade if we can't even produce at a reasonable cost? We talk about Nigeria first policy. How do we even fill the needs, the demand, if we can't produce properly and efficiently? So it's important, really, that some of these policies and reforms that we have put in place, that there's a proper tracking mechanism, and that there's a reporting line. We can see it online. We can see it on the internet, that who is producing, who is not doing what they're supposed to do, how is this thing moving? We need to see an implementation track. That's what we don't see. So we announce all these fantastic things, but we don't know who is doing what. We don't know how fast they're doing it. We don't know what the indicators are in terms of milestones. So it's important, from our private sector perspective, that implementation happens quickly, that, it translates to the common man. Reforms are great, but reforms will only be meaningful if it can affect the common man, if it can help the private sector to expand without bearing too much cost. There's a lot of cost pressure on the private sector, and we always want to say Nigeria is doing well, but if the profit margins are so thin, it is very difficult to be able to make that claim very confidently. And of course, the foreign investors are looking to the domestic investors to see how we are faring. And so if we are struggling, then we can say all these nice things, but it's not going to work if they look in and the Nigerian businesses are overburdened by all lack of infrastructure, and we're still saying, oh, they're in place, they are being worked upon, but there isn't a lot of impact. So I'll stop there for now, but I just know that all the things that we have talked about, if we get it going quickly, things will go well. Thank you.